Greetings, global gardeners, and welcome to 2026. This is our first show of the year, and I've missed you all. It's been a couple weeks. I'm so glad to get back into the swing of things, talking gardening on a Monday. What a great way to start our gardening week. 2025 had a lot of good things for me and in life in general. And in the garden, things are actually looking very good for 2026. It begins with January, first week of the year, thinking about what our garden is going to be for the rest of the year. Now, I think it's too early for many of us, especially me, to actually know which plants to grow and what the specific individual day-by-day plan during the growing season is going to be. But it's not too early to start thinking about the overall plan, the goals. What are you looking to do in the year ahead? And I think Lawrence hits the nail on the head. This is the way I like to begin the year looking at gardening. Lawrence says, I'm going to do a lot more companion planting this year and will concentrate on constant harvesting. So not a lot of specifics, no mention of individual plants. Instead, it's an overall goal, more companion planting and a constant harvesting. What is your approach to this upcoming year? Now, it could be, I want to grow more roses. It could be identifying specific plants from that perspective. But what do you hope to learn, to experiment with, to benefit from going forward in the gardening year? Defining that early in the year, I think, tends to make everything a little bit easier. So I've got all my catalogs. I'm beginning the process of choosing the seeds, what I'm going to grow, what I'm doing indoors, what I'm doing outdoors. But I haven't selected the specific varieties yet. I know I want to do tomatoes, a lot of tomatoes, a lot of cherry tomatoes. I know I want to do my peppers. I do that every year. I know I want to do some more squashes. I definitely want to do more beets. I haven't grown beets in recent years, but I'm looking forward to growing plants that maybe it's been a while, but also I like to look at the full season. So not just the harvests that I want to enjoy, the plants that I want to grow, but that last phase of gardening, which for me is preserving the harvest. And that's a big reason why beets are high on my list this year, because I'm looking forward to making pickled beets again and fermented beets again, in addition to a lot of the other things I'm doing in the garden. So that, in a nutshell, is my overall plan. Some specifics, a lot of things I've done before, and expanding more into some of the preservation side of it that maybe I've gotten away from. That's the individual planting plan. But I also have lots of build left in the garden. I want to focus on my walled garden. The weather has been incredible here in Colorado. The last few days, I have spent hours outside because it's so good. Today, it's supposed to be another day, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 Celsius. First week of January, this is so unusual. So I've actually been laying some paver stones. I did that yesterday. I've been moving soil back and forth. I've been doing work now that I wouldn't normally be doing till April or May, after the ground has thawed. The ground hasn't even frozen yet for me, which is highly unusual. So there's a lot of construction and build in my plan as I look to what the gardening year is going to be. The calendar plays an important part. Normally, based on your climate, based on your weather patterns. You will determine your schedule on a monthly basis. And I encourage that you do that. January is a good month to start planning the year, start selecting the seeds, and start thinking about those projects you're going to do over the course of the year. February, for many of us, is the time that we'll start some of those seeds to then transplant outside in March or April. For others of us who have a much longer winter, that might not happen until March and April when we start those seeds indoors to go outside. But now is the time to look at your calendar and start laying out that plan. When are you going to order your seeds? When are you going to start your seeds? When are you going to transplant your plants? By understanding the process that you use when it's cold outside, and I see in the comments most of you are having those cold days or having those rainy days. When you plan during a time when you can do it, relaxed in the warmth of your comfy chair, by the time the calendar rolls around to those critical days where you need to act, you're ready. You already have your plan in place. You've got your seeds ready. You're ready to actually start making it forward. Hi, Jay. Jay is back again for another year. Such fantastic assistance, saying, today, a garden plan can set the framework for an enjoyable and successful gardening year. Gardener Scott discusses how he creates a gardening plan. So if you're just joining us, that's what today is all about, is how we individually set our framework for the full year. I like using the calendar. It's a great way to establish a framework that's already in place. And we just plug into it the information that we have with our own specific desires and methods and goals. Ultimately, when we're talking about growing more plants, more ornamentals, more harvestable plants, more companion plants, start identifying that if you haven't done it already. And start thinking about the broad brush approach. That's what I think is best for January, is just laying out the overall broad approach. And that way you can start looking at the specifics. Shandy's Garden New Year to You says, Santa brought me a Tempest. That's a weather station that I like. And I haven't even gotten it out and gotten the app. Hopefully I get that put up. I really wanted it to be up by the 1st so that I could save my own data, but c'est la vie. And yeah, the thought is the start. So you definitely need to get out and get the Tempest up and operating. But that is a marvelous example of an approach to gardening. If because of me or Eli or any of the other weather geeks that talk about the weather stations in our garden on our YouTube videos, if you now have a weather station or you're interested in getting a weather station, do it. Load the app, start tracking the weather data. The calendar establishes the basic framework. Our climate is another basic framework that we can use in planning our garden. Now, everything is wonky for me this year. This winter is just not yet winter yet. We know it's going to hit. We know it's going to hit hard. We can use the calendar in association with typical climate patterns to also help determine when we're going to put those seeds in, when we're going to put the plants in, when we're actually going to start doing the actual gardening work. The basic framework for me, when I plug my climate in, is that I start most of my actual garden build, making sure the soil is amended, starting to measure the soil temperature, starting to think about putting the transplants out into the garden. For me, that happens in the beginning of May, because the middle of May is my average last frost date. And so plug that into your plan right now. When is your average last frost date? I start the active outdoor activities in April and early May based on my expectation because of my climate that the ground is frozen, it's starting to thaw, and I can start working outside. As I already mentioned, some of those activities, some of those build activities that I had initially programmed to be doing in May, I'm doing in January. When you put your plan together, don't think that it has to be so solid and unchangeable that you must follow that first plan that you put in place. Be flexible. I've been extremely flexible. I've gotten almost 2 weeks of build and cleanup done within the last couple of weeks that now I don't have to do in April and May. And so as I'm putting together this overall plan, I now am trying to figure out what am I going to do with that freed up time. I've got extra time that I didn't anticipate having because my initial plan said I was going to be busy doing those chores in April and May, but I've got free time now. Now I can start thinking about some of those other things, maybe the experimentation, maybe building a new bed because I didn't have that bed in my original plan because I didn't think I had time to do it. That's one of the things I did yesterday. I actually took my hexagonal metal bed and moved it to a completely different area yesterday because the soil within that bed was nice and warm. I went ahead and used that soil to create a border bed near my walled garden. That freed up that hexagonal metal bed to move to a new area. And I started thinking about ways to deter the deer from jumping the fence into my garden. One of the ways to do that is with obstacles. Deer are not going to jump over a fence if there's something in the way of their landing. So I moved that bed close to the fence where the deer come into my garden. That wasn't originally part of my plan, but because I was able to free up time and I tried to figure out what I could do with that time, I moved the bed. I'm not planning to fill it. I'm not planning to even begin growing in it until April or May. But the actual changing of the physical location and structure of my garden is part of the plan. And I used the flexibility, the good weather to be able to start implementing some of that. So what activities are you doing? What things in your plan or in your thought process, if you had time, you would do something else in the garden? What are those things that you can identify for yourself so that when that time pops up, especially when it's unexpected, you're ready. You're ready to take action. Now, I, like many people, I like enjoying free time. I like relaxing. I like taking advantage of some of those opportunities that pop up with more free time. Maybe, like I've been doing the last couple of weeks, you can swap it and do the chores when you wouldn't normally do the chores and save some of that free time for later on. Let me know what your thoughts are as we move forward. Shandy's Garden says, in my garden plan has to go by my office. They want to see my plan. I need to draw it out. I've never had to deal with that. And I also can't put things up close to my house. So mostly vertical. So there you go. A vertical garden. If you haven't done much vertical gardening, or if you have some of those issues where you can't put things up close to your house and you have to think of the alternatives, yeah, this is the time of year. I learned so much in January because I come up with ideas like this of vertical gardening, of preserving, of doing things in the garden. And if it's a new idea, if it's something I don't have a lot of experience with, January is the time of year that I research it, I learn more about it, and I prepare myself for making those things happen. So if you haven't done much with vertical gardening, but you're interested in it, watch some of my videos about vertical gardening, watch other videos, read blogs, get books. Now's a great time of year to start thinking about those new things so that by the time you go out for the first time to build that trellis, you already know what kind of trellis you're going to build. You already know what plants you're going to have grow up that trellis because you did the preliminary work early. And early is now. So take advantage of the now time. But Bowtie Life, Dave says, I plan to do a whole lot more complaining, but when I get into the garden, I find it nearly impossibly uplifting, and I always come back and feeling so blessed. Thank you for saying that. Yes, don't lose sight of the feeling in the garden. And I've been feeling my garden because I'm out enjoying it every day. A couple weeks ago, the last show of the year, I mentioned the idea of doing a video each month where I talk about that, what I'm feeling, what's happening in the garden. And so all these days that I'm going outside, I'm already building that video that will be coming in a few weeks, because that's a big part of why I garden, is just being outside, just enjoying it, doing those buildings, doing those chores, doing the weeding, doing the planting and the harvesting. All of those things are big reasons why I garden, because yeah, it gives me that uplifting feeling every time I'm in the garden. And I hope to be able to express that to you all through those new series of videos that are coming up. But how do you identify it? If you haven't been in your garden in a couple days, you're missing out. Even if it's rainy, even if it's cold and snowy, you can go back in my library and you can see videos I made when it was 5 degrees Fahrenheit outside. I mean, that is extremely cold. So when it's 5 degrees outside, about minus 16 Celsius, are you willing to get out in your garden and stand and walk around and look? This is the time of year, normally for me in January, when I would be seeing those temperatures, that I spend a lot of time just looking at the bare bones of the garden. In winter, the trees don't have leaves on them. If you've already cleaned up your garden, you basically just have a clear landscape. You can stand in your garden on that cold day, on that snowy day, and just soak it in. Just look at the bareness of your garden and envision what you want to fill it with. When you look at a bed and you recognize that that one spot is more bare than another spot, make that part of your garden plan. I do that every year. I look, I see emptiness, and I want to fill it. So I'll often take little plastic flags and put them in the ground in those spots to remind me that when I'm transplanting the flowers or the cuttings that are finally big enough to put in the ground, there's a spot. I identified the spot for the plant I'm going to put in the ground in May. I identified that spot back in January or early February. That's all part of my planning process, is identifying the holes in my garden that need to be filled. And so this last week, as I've been going through my large collection of seeds, particularly the perennial flower seeds, some of the grass seeds that I have, that's what I've been doing. I've been laying out the seeds that maybe I bought a couple years ago and never started, with plants that I really want in my garden. That's one part of the process. I really want to grow some delphiniums. I don't have delphiniums in my garden. Where am I going to put those delphiniums? I stand outside in January, looking around. Delphiniums are tall. I look at my fences. I think maybe some delphiniums along the edge of the fences. Oh, by the way, those new fences don't have any plants at the base. Now all of a sudden the plan is coming together. On one wall of my new enclosed garden area, on the outside of the walled space, I'm going to put delphiniums in addition to other plants. But I identified something that wasn't there, something that I wanted to be there, and then was able to pick out a location that needed a plant, and it all fits together. So getting in your garden is important. And like Dave says, even when you're complaining, you can't figure it out, you're not sure what's going to happen, just by getting out into the garden is almost as good as the summertime getting your fingers dirty in the soil. I don't mind shivering when it's cold and snowy outside if I can envision getting my fingers dirty in the soil once I start putting my plan into place. Sherry Ellison says, my plan is to get my first prothesis and be able to enlist the help of a friend to assemble metal and cedar ultra high raised beds. It may be all I can do to achieve that and start filling the bases. Good for you, Sherry. Yeah, I love that idea. The planning for that, as you well know, is more than just going outside and making it happen. There's definitely work involved. So I wish you the best. Get the prothesis, get that help, and start doing some of those activities. Start building those beds. What a great plan to be able to think about it now. And for all of us that have something that just gets in the way and we have to really think about and plan for, moving forward with that goal like you have is fantastic. And to be able to build those high raised beds, I love it. I absolutely love it. I talk a little bit about that in my book. I show some examples of the raised beds at the Denver Botanic Garden, where they are elevated specifically for gardeners who aren't able to do some of the activities that many of us are able to do. It takes planning. So kudos to you, Sherry. You have to let me know, all of us know, as you move forward, when you get to that point that you have those beds constructed and that you can actually start doing it. Filling the beds can be one of, if not the most time-consuming activity. Building beds is relatively easy. Even building the high beds, if you have the materials and if you have some help, that's relatively easy. But the problem with high beds is getting the material filled, or getting the material to fill that bed. So start now, absolutely, and get that help, make it happen, and then report back to us. I look forward to hearing that. I really do. So if I can remember, I'll ask the question as we get later in the season about what you all were able to accomplish as part of your planning to get your garden ready to go. Sherry, you're on that list. Definitely want to hear about it. Matt says, I'm looking to work on succession planting and interplanting in my vegetable gardens this coming year. To do that, I will need to plan and schedule seed starting and propagation so plants are ready. Yep, there you go. That's exactly my point about the calendar and the framework and the timeline. Succession planting, for those of you who may not fully be aware of it, is a process where you are putting plants in your garden beds successively over a period of time. I've actually already started doing it. I have some of my green stock towers indoors. So a couple of weeks ago, I planted the top layer with lettuce seeds. And about a week ago, I did the second layer with some more lettuce seeds. And then next week, I'll go down to the third level and start doing lettuce seeds. That is the precursor to succession growing. The idea being that those first seeds are going to germinate and start growing, and they have. A couple weeks later, that second layer is going to start germinating and growing. By then, those first seeds are a couple inches tall. And then by the time you get to that third set, the second set is a couple inches tall. And then the first set is noticeably bigger, almost getting ready to harvest. And so by working out your seed sowing or your plantings so that it continues kind of like on a treadmill where it just keeps going and keeps going, you're able to harvest on a much more continual basis. And it's a great way to grow a lot more than you might normally grow and to get that constant harvest. But it takes planning. It takes the calendar. It takes understanding the plants and how long it is that they need to grow before you can harvest. And so I think that's great, Matt. This is a great time of year to start the process of figuring out what you're going to grow using succession planting and when you first get them in the ground and how you're going to move through it. Another option for succession planting is planting everything at the same time, but you've chosen the plants with different harvest times. So for instance, you could do it with squashes or with melons or with cucumbers. Cucumbers is a good example. So I'll put 3 different types of cucumbers into the same bed. One of those types is pickling cucumbers. Another of those types is a small slicing cucumber. And the third is a large slicing cucumber. Well, they're going to be ripening at different times. So even though you start all the seeds at the same time, the harvests are coming at different times. So those pickling cucumbers are going to be happening early. You pick them when they're small. They'll keep growing, but you could conceivably pull them out once you've made a big harvest of pickling cucumbers and put something else in the ground. That's also part of the succession planting, where you're looking to maybe a fall garden. And so as you have this variability in the harvest times, you can pull out plants and put in more plants. The interplanting, as Matt mentioned, really makes that work. And I talk about that in a few of my videos, particularly with cover crops. But just because you've got tomatoes growing in a bed doesn't mean that that's the only plant you can have growing in your bed. I talked earlier about me wanting to grow more beets. Beets are a cool weather crop. They can handle cold weather. And so as I get later in the season and I've got my pepper beds and I've got my tomato beds, I'll start beet seeds in August. And so when September comes, and normally I'm starting to get the cool temperatures of September, early October, the freeze comes, kills all my tomatoes and peppers. By then, those beets that have been interplanted between the peppers and the tomatoes, maybe some of the other crops, those beets are already in place and they've already been growing for 4 to 6 weeks. They can handle the cool conditions that have killed those warm season plants. And I'm ready for a fall crop. So these are great ideas. I think that's a wonderful thing to do, to start planning and scheduling all of those seed starting and propagation times, because it's a fantastic way to really get the best from your garden and to really maximize the amount of space that you have in growing more and more plants. Gina McGregor says, this year I'm concentrating on planting timing. I want to extend my season and do more succession planting. Pepper seeds go in January 15th. There you go. Yeah, we are just talking about that. Figuring out the dates, in your case, January 15th for your pepper seeds. Awesome. Peppers generally take 10 to 12 weeks before they're big enough to start putting outside. And so using this as an example and figuring out a garden plan and how this works for you, if you've got a last frost date of, let's say, April 15th, And so you've got January 15th. So that would be February 15th is 1 month. March 15th is the second month. April 15th is the third month. That's 12 weeks. Pepper plants at 12 weeks is a great time to start thinking about putting them outside. So if your average last frost date is April 15th, it makes perfect sense to start your pepper seeds indoors on January 15th. And that's what I'm talking about when I say using the calendar as your framework and knowing what your average last frost date is. For me, my average last frost date is about May 18th. So I don't start thinking about starting my pepper seeds until February 18th. What's it for you? What's your average last frost date, and how are you going to do it? Now, when we talk about succession planting and we tie that into the picture, it's the same basic idea. If you have a lettuce that takes 45 days to harvest, you do the same thing. You look at your calendar and say, when do I want to be harvesting this lettuce based on my climate, based on the weather data that maybe you've collected to see what kind of trends happen in your garden. And then you back it up 45 days. And that's when you start that first batch of lettuce seeds. And then a week later, you do another batch. And a week later, you do another batch. You can figure all of that out months before it actually goes into the ground. And that's why this is such a wonderful time to start planning for that, because what else have you got to do except stand in your garden? And you can do both at the same time. Stand in your garden and make notes of what you want to grow and how you're going to do it. Robin says, well, I had a plan, but a fractured shoulder has changed my plans. Oh, no. So sorry to hear that. So simple, simple, simple may be my new mantra for the 2026 season. Yeah, you never know what's going to happen. I'm so sorry to hear that, Robin. I hope you recover quickly and as painlessly as possible. I know that's hard if you fracture a shoulder. But yeah, what's happening in your life that makes you have to modify your typical gardening plan? Now, Robin does a bunch of gardening and documents it with videos and shares all of her wonderful information. It's going to be different this year for her. Simple now becomes the new plan. How are you able to do things in your garden that you want to do if you have a whole shoulder arm that you're not able to use? Kind of like we were just talking about with prothesis and how that affects your garden plan. There's a lot of us that have those kind of issues. Simplicity could be the answer. Getting help is another thing. I'm terrible about asking for help in my garden. I love it all. I want to do it all. Asking for help is difficult, but sometimes you have to ask for help. And don't feel bad about that. There are a lot of people out there that are willing to help. They may not even know you need help until you tell them. So definitely ask for help when you start getting into that position. And, you know, if I go to help somebody, all I need is a sandwich and a glass of iced tea for payment. I don't help for any monetary gain. I help just because I like to help. And I get tired, I get thirsty, I get a little hungry. Simple payment. If you can find friends like that, snag them and use them to your benefit. But there's also some very cost-effective volunteer organizations that you might be able to hire some teenagers at a minimal rate if you need a bed that is empty and needs to be filled, or you've got some weeds that need to be dealt with. Ask for help and build that into your garden plan as you move forward. Lama says, I want to focus on consistent harvest, more succession sowing. Awesome. I'm glad to hear all this about succession sowing. What I eat the most as well as preservation. Oh, and timing of brassicas now that I have a grow light set up to start seeds. There you go. And so this was on my list of things to talk about. So this would be a good segue into the actual starting seeds indoors and how we approach that. So I'm glad to hear that you like the idea of succession planting. And so when I talk about starting seeds indoors, yeah, you've got to have a grow space. You have to have lights. You have to be ready to grow. If you want to do something like starting your own seeds and putting the transplants out, or doing the succession planting, or like I am with the perennial flowers and filling those empty spaces in the garden, you're going to need the grow space. If you don't have a grow space, think about putting that at the top of your planning list. Get the lights, get the trays, get the tables, get what you need to do to start doing that as part of your garden plan. And that should probably be happening relatively soon. So get those lights, get that build area started now in January so that you can start your seeds in February or March or whatever the appropriate time happens to be. Backyard gardener Jay says one of my big focuses this year is I'm going to double the amount of pollinating flowers. Awesome. I normally grow. They're so beautiful and I enjoy it so much. My neighbor has her own bees and her honey is delicious. So good for you. Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea. And so, a big area of my garden is my pollinator garden. And that's exactly what I did. And then what I'm continuing to do is I just prepared the space, and every year I add more pollinators. That is part of my gardening plan. Every year I add more pollinator plants to attract the pollinators to the garden. And don't forget, when you do that, and I've got a bunch of videos on this, think about putting a water source in, a water feature of some type to aid all of those pollinators that are coming to the garden. The flowers are a big part, but they also benefit from water. So I like to incorporate water as part of my pollinator garden plan. But I love that, doubling. And so a plan, when we start setting those goals, and if you've ever had any experience with the goal process, a goal really needs to be measurable and it needs to be attainable. And so if you are doing your review of your garden space and you recognize there's a lot of emptiness that needs to be filled, doubling could be a simple approach. I know what I did last year. I know what I've done in the past. I have a pretty definite number of plants or number of seeds that I start. And this year I'll double it. How simple is that? That's an easy way to garden. Choose a number and then decide, is it going to be 50% more, 100% more, the same, whatever it is, have a number in mind. Have some specifics in mind as you start developing your garden plan. And it can change. It can be flexible. Last year, my original plan, when I put daylilies into the garden, my original plan was for a dozen daylilies in this one particular bed. But then I got my granddaughters involved and we put in another dozen daylilies. By the end of the season, I think because I also divided some daylilies that I had and then moved them around. So my original plan was to have more daylilies in the garden, basic. That was the preliminary goal. Then I modified it to be 12 daylilies in this one particular area. Then I modified it again with the flexibility that gardeners have and doubled that. And by the end of the season, my initial plan of a few more daylilies ended up being, I think I ended up with 30 new daylily plants in my garden because I added more to my pollinator garden just to bring in some of that color and to have some more variety. So you don't have to have everything figured out right off the bat with your first iteration of your plan. You can change it. You can do whatever you want to do as you start figuring things out and you start moving forward with your plan. change it if you need to change it. Dusty Flat says, I need to make sure the garden can run on autopilot again as I search for future weather to see if that hideous sauna high 2 points will be the norm. And it was grim, can't handle that. Yeah, so that gets back to the idea of climate. And for many of us, those conditions are changing. So yeah, think about it. How are you going to modify your plan? Because you might have hotter days. You might have the dew point that increases. You might have more rain. In winter, you might have more snow. There's a lot of variabilities. This is where tracking your own garden data with your own weather system really becomes important, because you can start seeing some of these trends before the National Weather Service reports it, or before they change the hardiness zone map in another 5 or 6 years. You can start seeing that now, and you can make those modifications now and start putting them into place. How are you going to modify your garden to anticipate some of those conditions? And there's Jay. Thanks for mentioning that, Jay. Yeah, I like as I mentioned at the beginning, the Tempest weather station is awesome. And you can get a discount if you use the Gardener Scout code. So thank you for linking that. I really like the weather station. I've got a couple of them, and I compare the data in different areas of my garden, and it enters into my planning. I was just asked yesterday, do I plant by the moon? And I don't plant by the moon because my season is just too short. If I am getting close to planting time and I've missed the full moon, or I've missed the harvest moon, or if I've missed the planting moon, or wherever you are, what type of moon cycles you're following, I don't have the luxury to delay 2 or 3 weeks until the new moon arrives that may be appropriate for planting. I plant based on the soil temperature so that the seeds will germinate best, or the transplants will not be as shocked by the cold soil temperature. I'm focused more on the growing environment and not so much the moon. If you live in an area where it's more moderate, the temperatures aren't as variable as what I have in Colorado, you might be able to grow using the moon cycles. And if that's something that has interested you, now's the time to start learning about it. Learn what you need to do, learn what it means to plant using the moon cycles, and then pull your calendar out and see when those appropriate moons are going to be. And you can figure out when you're going to put your plants in the ground because of your garden and your moon and how it's going to benefit. Back up your seed starting dates so you're ready for the moon planting. That's something that requires looking at in advance. You can't just say, oh, I think I'm going to plant by the moon. And then you pull out and go, when was the last moon? Oh, I missed it. I guess I got to wait a whole month. No, plan for that well ahead of time, and you'll have much better success. Myra says, I purchased a garden planner and will use it to help with planting timing. Great idea. Also need to understand how to water correctly. Now's the time to watch videos on watering. I have one. There's a lot of information out there. Depending on where you get your seeds, if you get seeds from a catalog, there's a lot of catalogs that will have information about how to water plants, kind of books, of course, that are out there. So start thinking about that. Start putting those things into play now so that when you are out there watering your garden, you've already done some of that preliminary research. Then you just start building the experience based on what you've been learning. Dennis says, I'll be planning what peppers to grow this year. Jalapeno and serrano for sure. Chile de arbol for tamales is for sure as well. I love that idea. And so once you know that this is the next phase, once you know that you're going to be growing peppers, then yeah, you can start developing your plan to be more specific about which peppers you're going to grow. 2 years ago, and I talked about it a lot in the live streams and did the video about it, I wanted to make my own paprika. I knew months in advance of which peppers I was going to grow. The overall goal was I wanted to make my own paprika. That was it. As I learned more about it, I learned which peppers would make a sweet paprika powder and which peppers would make a hot or spicy paprika powder. Then I started doing research on availability of those varieties and where I could get them. And then I got the seeds. And then I started the plants using my average last frost date as a guide. Then I put them into my garden bed. And by the time the end of the season came around, I was harvesting a bunch of peppers with a bunch of different varieties and then drying them and making my own paprika powder. So you can see that planning is a process, but it starts with that initial idea of you want to make tamales and you want some authentic peppers to go in those tamales. That's a wonderful goal. Then you just figure out what peppers you need to get to make that happen. So good example. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a wonderful way to start the planning process. Mike says, bought a new house. Now the garden starts with a clean slate. I love clean slates. I'm getting older, so I'm going raised beds all the way. Awesome, good for you. Yeah, and you can see in the last 5 years of videos I've made, that's exactly what I did. I started with a clean slate. I started with raised beds. Since then, I've expanded to do my pollinator garden and to have an herb garden and to have my gazebo sitting space. And now I'll have my walled garden. But it all started with a blank slate and raised beds. So awesome for you, Mike. I think that's a great way to start a plan, knowing that you have a garden to build and how are you going to do it. And I love raised beds, as all of you know. That's not the only way to garden, and not everybody has to do it that way. But once you make that decision, run with it and make it happen, and then you'll be well on your way. So if you haven't figured out what kind of raised beds, start looking at that. And of course, my book has a ton of examples of raised beds, and I show how to build them because that's what I like to do is raised beds of all different types, and then trying to make it happen a little bit at a time. You don't have to do it all at once. You can do a little bit at a time and just gradually build up to a full garden. My first beds were wood. My next group of beds were metal. My next group of beds were concrete blocks. My next group of beds were flagstone. So it's a process of just adding more and trying new things. Karen at Garden for All Seasons says, planning and packing to move from Texas to Tennessee. Do you have any tricks and suggestions for moving garden items and plants? So yeah, I've mentioned before, all of the raspberries I have in my garden, all the strawberries I have in my garden, the rhubarb I have in my garden, some of the currants that I have in my garden. I've got a bunch of plants that have been moved multiple times. The original plants 25 years ago, I potted up and then moved to a new location. Now I haven't gone as far as from Texas to Tennessee, but the basic idea still is a valid one. Pot them up as early as you can in a pot that is a suitable size, so maybe slightly bigger than you might normally use, and give the plants time to establish in the pot. When you transplant, you're going to shock the plant. Going from the ground into a pot is often worse than going from a pot into the ground. And so the plant's going to be suffering. It's had some of its roots cut off. It's moving into a different environment with different heat and different light, different watering schedules. Do that as early as you can so that the plant is happy in the pot. Then you can move it. If you do it like the day before you move, the plant's going to be struggling. Now you're going to be putting it into the back of a truck or the trunk of a car that might be hot. You're adding extra stress to that plant. If the plant has gone past that stress cycle and the roots are established and new growth even is starting to appear with the plant in the pot, that's a good time to start moving it. So that's my biggest tip, is just to make the plant ready to move by planning in advance that you want to do it. And you know, a lot of plants are happy in pots. They'll get to a point where they need to be transplanted, so they'll slow their growth down when they're in a pot because the roots are constricted. There's no more space to move. That's not a bad thing if you want to move to another state and have those plants survive. Another option, depending on what kind of plants you're trying to move, if you want to do some cuttings of your plants, you can do that too. Cuttings can actually transplant very well. And so you might be able to wrap up those cuttings to stay moist, to keep them relatively cool during the transportation. And then when you get to the new home, start those cuttings in new pots or in the ground. Tennessee, depending on when you're moving, there's a lot of stuff you can just put a stick in the ground and it's going to root and you're going to have a new plant growing. So think about the cuttings and what's necessary for those plants to be able to start in a new location. But I wish you the best. You'll have to let us know how that works out, of course, as you move some of those plants. I've done the pot method. So when I did my raspberries, I just dug up raspberries and put them in pots. And I dug up some rhubarb and put it in a pot. And I dug up a currant bush and put it in a big pot. And the strawberries, same thing. I took the runners and I potted them up, and all of them have survived a move and multiple moves. Not the exact same plants, because I would take new plants each time to do it, but it's definitely doable. Just take some planning to make sure that you're able to get to the point that it has survived a trip and you can put it in the ground. ARN Nursery is saying, I get my seeds started indoors for my vegetable garden this time of year on the Gulf Coast, having hardly any winter here so far. Yeah, perfect example of how we are all different, and you use your own climate, use your own garden as a determining factor of when you're going to start. So if you're on the Gulf Coast, my son lives in Louisiana, and yeah, they're already starting their vegetable garden in Louisiana because it's all relative. They had some cold days. I mean, they've had days that have actually had a couple days that dropped down below freezing, which was shocking for them. But it's been a mild winter for much of the Gulf Coast area, and getting the seeds that match your growing timing is the way to do it. So have fun with that. I think that's awesome. The time we start our gardens, of course, is different for all of us, but it's equally exciting regardless of where we are. I just have to figure out when I'm going to do it, because I've got other things going on. You know, you start throwing in family obligations and travel. That's what I did this last year because of my trip to the UK in May. May is a big year for me in my garden, and I was gone most of May on that trip. And so I had to modify. Things that I would start in the middle of May, I didn't get started till the beginning of June. Things that would normally be started in April and tended to in May didn't get started at all because I wasn't going to be here to do it. The plan your overall garden plan should anticipate some of those activities. I'm looking at a trip in July this year that's going to take me away for a couple weeks. Part of my garden plan is figuring out what is going to happen in my garden in July when I'm not here to do it. Now, luckily, I have a granddaughter who should be able to move in and take care of the garden, but she needs to be educated in what needs to be done. That's part of my garden plan this year. I'm already looking 7 months out to what I'm going to be doing in my garden because of some of those other factors that are going to be involved. Doesn't have to be just you. If you've got somebody else, like we were talking about earlier, getting help filling the beds or doing some of your garden development or seeding or planting or harvesting, start thinking about that now and figuring out what you need to do so that you're not waiting till the last minute, so that the plan is in place and you have all of those resources already lined up, ready to go. Matt says you need to remember where the sun is in the sky during the summer when you're considering planting locations in winter. The sun angles can be wildly different. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've got a video that I made, I think in January, a few years ago, where I talk about that, actually measuring the shadows in your garden. And then I've also talked about that in videos talking about the summer. I like to identify, I was just doing it this last week because we just had the solstice. I know exactly where the edge of the shadow is on the shortest day of the year. So as I start looking at what I'm going to put in the ground, particularly the perennials, the plants that benefit from full sun, I use that line. I have a good idea that if I were to put a plant in an area over off to the side, it's going to have shade well into March or April. Then it gets full sun. But a lot of plants in the landscape, the perennial plants, the fruit bushes, they need that early sun to do best. And so looking at the shade in winter is as important as looking at the sun in summer when you're talking about those kind of plants. So you're exactly right, Matt. You do need to do a map of your garden. And whether you call it a shade map or a sun map, you need to map out the light within your garden because it is dramatically different in winter versus summer, as Matt points out. So yes, thank you for raising that point. That is definitely an important factor as you start to put it all together. Serena's asking, how long does ground cover take to fully compost once turned into the soil before it's ready for planting? It depends. I've got buckwheat that I grew and turned into the soil. Buckwheat as a cover crop, turned it into the soil. Soft tissue breaks down pretty quickly. So if the soil is warm, if the soil is moist, you can have those soft leaf plants break down in a month, maybe 6 weeks. If it's something a little more durable that you're turning into the ground that maybe has a thicker stalk, then it would take longer. So it all depends on the plant. It depends on whether it's a small plant or a big plant. So there's no single answer for that. You have to look at the plants you're using and how big they are and what kind of structure they have. Then you can start thinking or start planning for how long it's going to take for them to break down. I like to plan at least 2 months. So if I've got a cover crop that I'm turning into the ground in spring, I want to be doing that at least 2 months before I put plants in that same space or seeds in that same space. So it's a guideline. 2 months is usually enough. But again, it gets down to the individual plants to really determine for sure how long it's going to take and what you're going to be putting in the ground later. Because you can take your ground covers and turn them in the ground in March or April, depending on when your soil thaws. And if you're not planning to put anything into that space for 3 months, oh yeah, that's definitely enough time to be able to get things or get the soil ready. The big issue when you're looking at that is if you do it too soon, plant too soon, you still have raw material in the ground, the leaf material, the stems, the roots, and the microbes are using nitrogen to decompose that organic matter. Nitrogen is what plants are going to be using when they start their growth cycle. So if you put a new plant in the ground, one of the first nutrients it's looking for in the soil is nitrogen, so it can start growing new lush green growth. If the microbes are using that nitrogen to decompose the organic matter, then you have less nitrogen available for the plants. So that's why you want to do it as early as possible, so that that organic matter has been decomposed, and that decomposing organic matter releases new nitrogen into the soil for the plants to use. So there's a time factor, again, with the planning of cover crops and amending the soil. And so I haven't talked about that yet. Amending the soil. In fact, next week's live stream, actually, I'll be talking about soil and building the soil, because this is the time of year to start thinking about building your soil, partly because of what I just talked about. So when you put the plants in the ground, they're ready to start growing, and you're not necessarily feeding the microbes at the expense of the plant. So we'll be talking more about that next week. But this is a great time of year to build that into your plan. When are you going to amend the soil if you haven't already? When are you going to turn over those cover crops? When are you going to transplant based on the soil in those beds and whether it's ready for the transplants? Those are definitely things that you need to build into the planning process. So I see that Tony and Eli and Kate have signed on. Always good to see you here. Happy New Year to you all. And just helps maintain our global audience. This is so fantastic. Gardens Happen says, I usually put Ethiopian kale and red Russian kale together. The red kale will start dying back when the weather gets warmer and acts as an aphid trap. Oh, I love this idea. And so part of the planning, and I've done this for a long time. I don't have much of a pest problem anymore, but particularly in the early years of a garden, before you've built up that predator population, you have to start thinking about things like that. A trap plant. And what can you grow in your garden that works well for a trap plant? I've mentioned before about the native currant bush that I had outside my gate, and every year the aphids would attack that plant first. The ladybugs would come in, and I had little, if any, aphid problem in my garden. I took that bush out. I attempted to transplant it. It didn't transplant well. But now I don't have that trap plant anymore. So I'm in the same mode. I've got to think about the possibility that aphids will come into my garden, and they're no longer attracted to that currant bush. They're going to be looking for other plants. And if I can put a trap plant in place to attract all those aphids, that needs to be part of my garden plan. I need to figure out what that plant is going to be and where it's going to go, so that it achieves the same purpose as that other plant that is no longer there. You can see how every year your garden plan is going to be different because of the modifications you've made to your garden. And I took out a critical bush, and I haven't replaced it with something that is going to be as good. So I hadn't thought about kale as an option. I was thinking about lettuces and spinach, but I like the idea of using red kale to maybe attract some of those aphids. And the key here that is pointed out is that when the plant starts dying back, that's when the aphids are going to attack. When the plant is weak, when the plant is stressed, that's when the aphids attack. So choosing the right kind of plant that's going to be weaker than everything else in the garden is what you're looking for when you're trying to figure out what trap plant you're going to use. And so I haven't thought enough about that yet. I know I have that goal, but like I said in the beginning, this part of my garden planning process is to identify those goals, those things I need to do. And now in the next couple of weeks, I'll pull out my catalogs and I'll start going through them to decide the individual plants. Red kale wasn't on my list, but it may be the solution that I was looking for. That's how the planning process works. As you accumulate the information, as you share ideas with others, and others give you suggestions of what you could do, that's how you develop your plan to be more precise and to be ready to put into action. So thank you for that suggestion. I think it may be something that I can use to my benefit. and that's what's so wonderful about our gardening community, is being able to use those ideas from others that we know can be beneficial for us. And so Big Will Dog is asking, isn't the compulsion to do it all a military thing? Most vets are like that, me included. So I've talked a little bit about this before. I don't know if it quite rises to the level of compulsion, but sure, yeah, my training was in the Air Force, and we would often spend more time planning a mission than the actual time of the mission. So we might be planning a 3-hour flight, and we would spend 8 hours planning that 8-hour flight. So yes, part of it is a military thing. That's how I learned. That's how I received my training. And now I carry that forward as I plan my garden. I spend months planning my garden. January, February, March. There's the seed ordering. There's the seed starting. There's a lot of prep work before I put that first plant in the ground. But you've seen my videos during the growing season. That's one reason why my garden looks so good. That's one reason why the plants do so well in a challenging environment like I have here in Colorado. It's all that prep work. It's all that planning and the development of that plan that really makes it work out. And so I don't see it as a bad thing because it usually works out to my benefit. Pat Patrick is saying, reviewing the journals I began 4 years ago, I used them to make my plan for this year. Great idea. What worked, what didn't, what I want to try again that didn't work. Fantastic suggestion. Yes, if you've been documenting, if you've been journaling, if you're keeping track of what's happening in your garden, don't throw that information away. Use it. That's part of the reason that we keep a garden journal, is so that we can go back to it. And 4 years worth of information, how valuable is that? If you could have someone come over to your garden and they have 4 years of experience, 4 years of knowledge, 4 years of practical application, more than you, wouldn't you welcome them into your garden? Well, now if you think about it, that is you. All of those things you've learned over the last 4 years now means you're the 4-year more experienced gardener than you were when you are looking back at those journals. So yeah, use that information, even if it's you are the expert in your own garden because you started keeping track of it. I forget so much about the things that happen in my garden. A review is important. So thank you for that, Pat. That's a fantastic suggestion. Look back at what you did and make modifications. The last show last year, that's what I asked all of you to do, was to look back on last year and start making note of what worked, what didn't work, what you want to do differently. It's only been 2 weeks. And so if you started making some notes and started thinking about it, now's the time to start putting it into play for the plan of 2026. And if you can go back further than that, with those years that you've been compiling information, that's the way to do it. Daniel Johnson saying, I'm so excited for this year of gardening. Me too. I think almost all of us are excited about this year of gardening. So thank you for your excitement. I love that. I love the excitement of gardening. I suppress it often so that I don't, go overboard. But yeah, I'm excited as well. So good for you. I think that's fantastic. And Daniel saying, I hope you all have your gardens covered in leaves. That was one of the big activities I did this year, or this last week, actually. I had covered a lot of my beds with a light mulch, just preparing as I was cleaning up the garden. And I've got bags and bags of leaves. That's exactly what I did in my asparagus beds in particular. For some reason, and this goes back to keeping track of what you do and what you don't do. For some reason, my asparagus beds just always got left out. I would make sure that my strawberry beds were taken care of. I'd make sure that my vegetable beds were taken care of. I'd make sure that I freshly mulched my perennial beds. And my asparagus beds, for whatever reason, just got forgotten. I made a point this last week to do exactly this. I put about a 3-inch layer of crushed leaves along with some dried grass clippings on my asparagus beds. That was relatively new. I normally don't do that until springtime. It should be done in winter. I've been telling you all that for a long time, and I don't always do it myself. So yeah, if you've got extra leaves, and especially with the moderate conditions that many of us have been experiencing, get out there and spread those leaves on your garden beds, and get the soil protected throughout the winter. Our hen house says working on a new medicinal garden for making meds. Cool. Yeah, I did a video or two about that at the beginning of last year. That was one of my goals last year, was to start putting in those plants for medicinal garden. And the feverfew, oh my goodness, I had no idea feverfew was going to do so well in my garden, but I put it there for this same reason, and it is in a happy spot. So now last year, I put the plants in the ground, I let them get established. And then, yeah, this year that's one of my goals, is to start using some of those plants medicinally in different ways, as I start figuring out just exactly how they're going to be best suited in my diet and for all the things that I want to be doing. Because we put vegetable plants in and we harvest them to eat. Medicinal plants might be something for you to think about as you are developing your plan and you've got that empty space and you're not sure what to put in that space. Start thinking about something like that. I put in the stinging nettle in my garden primarily to use as in developing a liquid fertilizer for my other plants. But as I started looking into medicinal properties of different plants, nettle has some amazingly beneficial properties. And so I harvested last year some of my stinging nettle beds or leaves to make tea, and I'll be doing more of that this year. So as you learn more about what your plants can do for you, you may realize you already have some of the plants in your garden and you just didn't know their capability. Thinking at all about medicinal plants, think about it. Get those seeds, get those plants, fill those spaces. You might find a whole new area of gardening that you weren't even aware of. Doug McQuaid says, I have a 30-year-old perennial garden that has been neglected and needs a total overhaul. Some plants have taken over and the microclimate has changed from sunny to part shade over the years. That sounds like you've already got your goal figured out. So, in line with what I've been talking about today, the plan is to get that perennial garden back up to speed and to give it the overhaul, which means, understandably, taking some plants out that have taken over, putting more plants in because the plants you took out will now free up space, and then figuring out, if you've got more shade, what kind of plants to put in that will benefit from that increase in shade. So those are the factors. You've already identified them. Now the next step is start figuring out what plants you want to put in, and they might be medicinal plants. A lot of medicinal plants are amazing perennials. They look great, they bring in the beneficial insects, and it's a great way to fill some space. So that's a great goal this year, is to totally revamp a garden that is no longer giving you what you want. And that's an important point when we look at our planning of our garden. things don't have to stay the same. You don't have to keep all the plants in the same place every time. You can mix it up. You can move plants. You can pull out plants and put in more plants. I've got one area, so in my walled garden, that you'll be seeing more of that this year as I develop it. But in my walled garden, that's where I put my goji berries. So goji, talking about the plants you move from one garden to another. When I moved, I dug up some goji, I potted, I brought them to this new house. My plan called for them in this one area of the garden by my greenhouse. I put them in place. And now that I am looking at what I'm going to do with this surrounded area that these walls will enclose, I realize that's not where I want my gojis anymore. So this last year, I did it all over again. I dug up some of those gojis. I moved those transplants to a whole new area, and I'll have gojis in a completely different section of my garden. That wasn't part of my original plan, but plans evolve. And so now, one of the things I'll be doing in spring is digging up those plants, deciding whether I want to move them to another area entirely, if I want to add some of them to the goji bed that I developed this last year, or if they're done. If I pull them out and throw them in the compost pile or chip them up as mulch, I haven't figured that out yet. But I know those plants are coming out. And it's hard because we all, this planning process, as we've been talking about, takes time. There's a lot involved with it. And it's hard to pull out a plant that you put in the ground 3 years ago, and it's still doing great. But if the plan changes, it's okay to pull your plants. It's okay to go ahead and come up with a new plan and put in something different in that same area. Don't feel too guilty when you modify your beds. They're your beds. You can do whatever you want with them. Eddie Lyles is saying, I recently burned my property and my blackberries are looking beat up. Will the roots survive the fire? Will they produce this year? If so. So the roots should survive the fire. Yeah, that shouldn't be an issue. The issue with blackberries is that most of the blackberries we grow fruit in the second year. So you need to have the cane up and remaining up after the first year. And then the next year is when they're going to flower and fruit. And then you cut them back in that second year and you just keep that cycle. So you keep the 1 year canes, you cut back the 2 year canes after you've harvested. The next year, those 1 year canes become the 2 year canes that you're going to harvest. New 1 year canes pop up. And so what you're probably going to see, Eddie, is that you're not going to get a harvest this year. You're going to get that new growth if the roots survived, and you're going to have to wait until that first year growth becomes the second year growth. It's the primal canes in the first year become the floral canes in the second year, and that's what you're going to be harvesting from. So you'll probably get plants. A fire that just rolls across a property is usually not enough to kill the roots of most of the plants we're growing in our landscape. But it's going to take 2 years for most blackberries before you get that fruit. So care to them, tend to them, just be aware that there is some delay in that process before you have to, or before you get to the point of harvesting the blackberries. And I'm kind of in that mode. One of the things I did, expecting winter to come sooner and harsher, was I enclosed an area for my blackberries. I have a few blackberry plants, but that's one of my goals this year, is to grow more blackberries in this big bed that's surrounded by concrete blocks that I developed. And I know it's going to be 2 years for those blackberries that I'll be putting in the ground this year before I can harvest them. I know that. It's part of my plan. It doesn't stop me from putting my blackberries in that bed this year, because that's why I built the bed. That's one of those goals I have for this year, is to get blackberries in the ground. Hopefully I'll be harvesting some blackberries this year from those few plants that I had put in before, and then I can get into that cycle. The garden plan does not need to be just this year's plan, this year's long-term plan. It can also be next year's plan that needs to be started early, because it could take a couple years to get going. Brian's asking, anyone in need of any common milkweed seeds? I still have pods on last year's plants, already cold stratified, free for the asking. So yeah, send Brian a note if you need some milkweed plants. Milkweed plants, beautiful flowers. The orange flowers on my milkweeds, my butterfly plants, are so fantastic. And I love them coming back and breaking open those pods with those little feathery seeds blowing around. That's a lot of fun too. So I hope you're able to find a home for those seeds. Wasabi Gal saying, I need some tips for yard plants that would be pretty in my shady area here in zone 3-4. So I say it a lot. I would suggest going to your local nursery and seeing what they have, and either using their plants or using that as incentive, talking to the gardeners at the nursery and maybe getting seeds that you can plant. There are a lot of really hardy plants. So some of the ones that I have in my landscape that I'm pretty sure are hardy to zone 4, can't necessarily talk about zone 3, but echinacea, my cone flowers, very hardy, very durable in my zone 5, and pretty sure they're zone 4. Rudbeckia, the black-eyed Susan, I love them too. Daisies, a couple different types of daisies, I love them too. Those are really hardy plants that have done well in my landscape, and I think they're suitable for colder zones. So, but check locally and see what other gardeners are growing. And the plants I just mentioned do well in partial shade. I mean, they prefer sun, that you'll get more flowers if there's more sun. But check what other gardeners in your zone are growing, and that'll give you a better idea of trying to decide what it is that you want to do. So Pablo Tescano is saying, I am in summer in South America. I'm building a greenhouse by myself. The weather is really hot and it seems strange building a greenhouse. I'm planning for the next winter. Fantastic example. I love this idea. Yeah, we've been talking about figuring out what plants you're going to grow, but like I was talking about, some of the build projects I'm doing with laying pavers and other things now, absolutely do what you need to do for that long-term plan. And so if, and you don't have to be living in the Southern Hemisphere, but if your plan is to have a greenhouse and to grow winter plants in it, start thinking about that now. And no, I don't think it sounds strange at all, building a greenhouse in summer. In fact, I built my greenhouse that I grow some plants in when the weather is cold. I built that in the summer. I did a lot of research in winter to figure out which greenhouse I wanted. I went with the Planta Greenhouse. I got that link below. I know that they don't supply South America, I'm sorry to say. But yeah, I did a lot of research. And then in summer, I got my greenhouse kit. I built it myself. And I was ready that first year to start figuring out what I needed to do to grow in a greenhouse. And I've got a bunch of greenhouse videos that show that process as I was developing it. So no, that's not at all strange, Pablo. I like that idea. That is definitely the approach to take. And now actually, and so here's another piece of greenhouse growing, is it's difficult to grow during the summer in a greenhouse, particularly if you live in an area that gets hot summers. So it took me a whole year of collecting the data of the temperatures within my greenhouse to begin to understand just how difficult it was. And so my greenhouse, if I did nothing it would get up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius within a few hours after sunrise in the summer. Ventilation is critical. So first thing every summer morning, I'm going out and opening up my greenhouse, opening up the vents to keep the temperature from rising too quickly. You don't understand that until you have a greenhouse in summer where it's really hot, to see that you have to plan for what you're going to grow. And a lot of people think a greenhouse gives you year-round growing. That's not always the case. Often, for many of us, you can't grow in a greenhouse in the summer because it's just too dang hot. Even with ventilation, it can be too hot. So start learning all that stuff, Pablo. And I think that's fantastic. That's a great example of planning for well into the future. It's the kind of thing that the preparation that you make now will definitely pay dividends into the future. Tony says, I cut my goji back to the ground. They have never fruited for me despite the plants getting huge. I'll get some different ones. Yeah, do that, Tony. I actually planted 2 different types of goji, and one of them has never fruited, but the other has been pretty proficient, or prolific, I should say. And so that's what I did. When I started transplanting to this new area, I just totally abandoned. I didn't even attempt to transplant the goji variety that didn't do well for me. I focused on the ones that did well, and those are the ones that I've transplanted. And in the spot that they were in, I neglected them. I really didn't do much to keep them happy, and they still fruited. This new area, I'm anticipating that I'll have much better success. So finding the right variety is important. And I saw someone mention that James Prigioni is not planning to grow gojis again as either. But when you find the right variety, and it's fun, you know, gojis are one of those kind of weird fruits. I don't think they're particularly good fresh. They're kind of good when they turn into a raisin. And maybe someday I'll have enough gojis to make a goji jam, which I've never heard of before, but I want to make it. And so that's a big reason why I'm growing my gojis. So as you start putting your plan together, think about those kind of things. What is it you want to do, and why would you be growing that plant? I've been struggling. I'm very, very tempted to get jujube trees. I've got 2 sections of my garden where I want to put trees. I've got a bunch of apple trees. I've got pear, I've got plum, I've got peach, and I'm trying to think of what I want to do. I've never eaten a jujube fruit. I have no idea what it tastes like, but the idea of growing jujubes in Colorado is just enticing to me. That's one of those things as I'm developing my plan, is thinking about the experimentation. What new things do I want to try? We already talked about the timeline and looking into the future. If I were to put a new tree that I've never grown and nobody I know grows, it's going to be 3 to 5 years before I even get to the point of fruiting. Is it worth it? Now, I have to answer that question for myself, and I still haven't figured out the answer. But as you look at developing your garden plan, ultimately you have to just answer that question for yourself. Is it worth it? When you make your choices, when you get to selecting your seeds and your plants and actually laying out where you're going to be putting the plants in your garden for the growing season, is it worth it? Was it worth the planning? Was it worth the preparation? Is it something you really want? I don't need jujubes. I don't necessarily want the fruit of the jujubes. I just want to be able to say I did it. That's the internal struggle that I'm dealing with right now. And I've got the space. You have to figure out, based on your own space, what you are able to do, and then tie that into what you need to do and what you want to do. When you put all these factors together, you can start figuring out your garden plan. And if it hasn't started yet, if you haven't started doing these thought exercises of what your garden's going to look like in its prime, or if you're in South America, what your winter is going to look like. If you haven't started doing that, now's a great time to start thinking about it. Now's a great time to do it. And I suggest, as we finish here, that you go ahead and take some notes and go walk out into your garden and just stand out there. Even if it's cold, even if it's a little bit rainy, go out into your garden today and just observe and walk around and start thinking about those bare spots that need to be filled. Start thinking about those new beds that need to be built. Think about some of the limitations that you might have in bringing your plan to fruition and what you need to do to make it happen. All of that can start today. And I encourage you to get out there and to actually start making it happen. Next week, we're going to start talking about soil. Then we'll start getting into the seeds. This is going to be a whole new year with all new processes to get all of this to that point where we've got fun and active gardening potential. So make it happen today. I'll be back next week. We'll be talking a lot more in the many weeks to come. Thank you all for being here. I hope you've had a wonderful start to the new year. And I look forward to all of these Mondays that we have together. So get outside, get into your garden, and of course, at every step, enjoy it. I'm Gardener Scott. I'll see you next week.